What exactly is a Nazi? What exactly is that? Is it a liberal? Is it a conservative? Is it a socialist? Well, today we're going to find out. Hi, my name is Aaron, this is my show Reeducation, and today we're going to find out, are Nazis socialists? Let's get started. So, are Nazis socialists? Well, to really understand what that even means, we're going to have to look at the definition of socialism. Socialism is basically the social ownership of the means of production. Pretty straightforward, makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately it kind of leaves out a few key aspects. Specifically, how we organize having social ownership of the means of production. But what does that even mean exactly? I mean, traditional socialists like myself believe that all people should be common owners of the means of production. And if they work in a factory that's making shoes, they should be a common owner of that factory and own a part of those shoes. And if you're an artist, you own your own artwork. And if you're a painter, you own your own painting. Those sorts of things. That's kind of how traditional socialists look at the idea of socialism, social ownership of the means of production. But there is also another version of socialism. There are others who, instead of believing in common ownership of the means of production, where the individual workers own and control the businesses and factories that they work at, instead they believe in public ownership of the means of production, where the workers tangentially own and control the means of production, but through the use of a state. Basically, they democratically elect a representative who decides how the means of production are used on a daily basis, and the workers themselves just simply work at those factories and businesses without owning them directly. To me, that sounds a bit dubious, but it is still technically a branch of socialism. And that's kind of the interesting thing about the word socialism, is that it can mean many different things in many different contexts, depending on who you are, when you are, and how you decide to use the term. Sometimes socialism can mean the common ownership of the means of production. Sometimes it can mean the public ownership of the means of production. Sometimes it doesn't have to mean that at all, and it can actually refer to a transitionary period between capitalism and full-on communism. Depending on how you use the word, changes the meaning of that word. Just because I believe that socialism should mean the social ownership of the means of production by way of the workers directly owning those means of production, doesn't mean that that's necessarily the only type of socialism. Very similar to, like I was saying, capitalism was in the other video, socialism is different in every country that it's ever been implemented in. So in certain countries, socialism is radically different than in other countries. Just like how capitalism, like I said before, is radically different in Denmark than it is in Saudi Arabia. Both capitalist countries, both radically different in the way that they implement that capitalism. So too is socialism. Socialism can be radically different everywhere that it's being tried, and is radically different everywhere that it is tried. So using that definition, that's kind of where National Socialism sneaks its ugly little head. They too believe that society should be able to determine a certain number of people that should be elected into positions of power so they can control and manipulate the means of production, but the difference is that they don't use representative democracy to choose those people. They choose those people through social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, again, I've been through this in several other videos, is the idea that survival of the fittest did not mean specific genes winning out over other genes over long periods of time. They think, the Nazis that is, that social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, specifically has to do with social interactions and interracial interactions. That means that in every instance throughout all social activity, you have to be trying to win. That you must be the strongest in order to survive and, in fact, to thrive. So the idea that these fascists basically have is that these representatives shouldn't be elected to the top. They should fight their way there. They should fight and manipulate and use force and use their strength to claw their way to the very top, because if they're able to do that, then clearly they are the superior being, the Übermensch, like I was talking about in the other video. But that's kind of the whole idea of fascism. It takes whatever's popular and in the mainstream and manipulates it and twists it to become a tool for the establishment. It takes populist unity and worker control and ownership of the means of production and twists that around to mean unity of the populace, but under the banner of the nation or of the race. Back in the day, during the rise of fascism, the most popular ideas of the time were things like populist unity, socialization of the means of production, the idea that the people should own the means of production and not the capitalists, and representative democracy. And fascists looked at all of that and said, okay, well, that's really interesting. We'll give you the social ownership of the means of production, sure, just as long as that social hierarchy is determined by social Darwinism. We'll give you anything that you might want. We'll give you unions. We'll give you representation. We'll give you everything that the workers are crying for, so long as you vote for the fascists. All people of one nation working together socially for the benefit of that nation. National Socialism. That's how they got there. That's how they got to the idea of National Socialism. It's not the social ownership of the means of production, of course not. It's a manipulation. It's the elites manipulating their way into the idea of socialism and creating a branch of socialism that fits their rule, that allows them to continue to own and control you. And that's just one of millions of ways in which Nazis and socialists are completely different from one another. Of course, I picked out the most obvious one, being that the word National Socialist doesn't even use the word socialist properly. It's more or less referring to social Darwinism and not the democratic control and ownership of the means of production. But there are many different ways in which Nazis are totally different from socialists aside from that. Specifically, the fact that most socialists, communists, and so forth are international, whereas Nazis are specifically nationalists. Nazis are a branch of fascism, which uses authoritarian and totalitarian styles of government to control their people, whereas almost every branch of socialism, outside of maybe the Nazbols, uses a form of democracy to choose what is done with the means of production. There are so many differences, I can't even list them all in a 4-hour-long video. And that's why I get so frustrated when people link the two together as though they're somehow similar ideologies. Just because the only ideology you've ever been exposed to is capitalism doesn't mean that every other ideology under the sun is therefore Nazis. That's just myopic. That's a tiny, tiny-brained way of thinking about the world. So was National Socialism actually socialism? Fuck no, of course not. All it was a bastardization of the idea of socialism. All of the people together in unison working for the nation. National Socialism is basically a joke ideology. And even Hitler understood that it was. He railed against socialism since the very start. In fact, one of the first things that he did when he came to power was went out and murdered every last one of the socialist and communist Nazis. So to say that socialists are somehow Nazis or that Nazis are somehow socialists is to not understand socialism and to not understand Nazism in general. At least that's the way I look at it. My name is Aaron. If you do get a chance, please check out my Patreon. Every dollar does help fund this show, and thanks for watching.